Chinese economy, your assessment, a lot of challenges, but still people are working very hard for an update. So what do you think is the latest situation?
Look, it's still going to be the bright spot if you look around the world. We're really seeing a lot of economic challenges worldwide, not only in Western economies, but also in developing countries, really suffering a great deal from the post-pandemic world with a large amount of debt. So I think China's, if it can maintain 5% growth, of course, it's already very remarkable. But we also have to look at it in terms of the context. I think there are some structural challenges to the economy. China has reached $10,000 per capita income, but how do we get to 30,000, even higher? And making that leap is going to be more difficult than the first $10,000. So I think weaning the economy off of property, less reliance on investment, and of course the global situation with reduced external demand puts a lot of pressure on the Chinese economy. But there's still lots of bright spots. Service sector only represents a little more than half of GDP. It can go up to 80%. And there are a lot of more distortions prohibiting flows of goods and people around the country. So lots to work on.
What about investment? We have seen a renewed energy for attracting foreign investment into China. You see the local officials, for example, from local governments around China are going outside China and try to persuade more foreign capital coming in. But what exactly is the situation, especially when you are based in Europe?
I think the greater uncertainty is causing lots of people to rethink the risk and return trade-off. And maybe we're in a risk-off moment, and that's a global cycle. It's not just particular to China. But added to the fact that China was in a situation where there was less communication with the rest of the world in the last few years. We're just opening up, and I think at the forum, at the New Champions meeting, it's all about China's open for business. But where's the appetite? Is there appetite for more investment in risky areas is really the question.
New technologies, of course, is bringing us a lot of new momentum in China. Infrastructure for digitization is certainly one of the quite best in the developing world, and huge base as well. But how much will the overall structural changes happening as a result of the new technology is still be a question mark?
Well, technology is obviously going to be critical. It is the only factor that will sustain growth in the long run. So that's why it's good to be putting in so much effort on innovation. But really, we're searching for something to replace this gigantic mammoth industry of property. And it's not something like renewables or hard tech can easily be equal in measure to providing the kind of jobs and investment. So we have to be realistic. It's a transition towards slower but higher quality growth, more sustainable growth, and that means there has to be sacrifice made along the way. And so in the transition, maybe slower amount of growth. But in the long run, it's just the only thing that matters is productivity.
So what do you see, Professor, when you are based in Europe, talking to international business community often, would be the best way to be persuasive based on facts?
In the West, they've taken 100 years to understand the importance of communication, transparency, and in fact, the flip side of being more open is that the demands are higher for you to kind of transmit, carefully the information. There's very little room to hide. If you're shutting behind your doors in a very closed economy, there are lots of things you can do behind the scenes that you can't do when you have investors, international investors, kind of holding you up to that standards. So it's actually a good commitment device to be. So open up further and more transparency.
At this moment, we have seen, for example, Chinese Premier Li Qiang visited recently to Europe. Looking at the prospect of European businesses, how do you look at the reality, which has been quite a big base, but what is the momentum here?
Well, in Europe, the economy is suffering from, really important challenges and potentially structural, but also short-term due to the geopolitical situation. So if you ask these different groups of countries in Europe, they have really strong motivation to get their economy going. And echoing the Premier's speech, it's about collaboration. It's about making the pie bigger. And the Europeans understand very thoroughly how important it is to keep open the trade and investment channels. And I think it's striving to build more of these bridges, no matter how challenging the circumstances are. And different countries will have different priorities between security and the economy, but I have to say, from what I'm hearing by being there, that economic interests are becoming priority recently. First of all, they're looking more introspectively. What does the government need to do? Potentially more fiscal policy. You know, actually, there are lots of challenges around all these countries, and even the UK. There's a great deficit in investment in public education to the detriment of the quality and standards. So they're asking themselves, what should the government do more? And second, of course, is the global connection. Now, China is very much integrated in the global supply chain. It is one of the largest exporters and importers of intermediate inputs, which goes into other people's production and makes them more productive. And so it's very important to keep those channels open and to harness the stability of the supply chain and reduce costs.
U.S.-China, since you mentioned it, I will also want to touch on that. Secretary Blinken from the U.S. visited China. It brings some kinds of positive atmosphere, at least, to this relationship in front of the public. But how much do you see this is only the very beginning of the beginning, or this is only a brief moment looking at what is ahead in politics?
I think we might see some pendulum swings. Sometimes when it's gone too far in one direction, politicians will want to correct it back, and there's a degree of mean reversion. Although we don't know what the trend is like, potentially not so optimistic on that front. But I think there's always that level of sanity and expertise around these key politicians that will try to stabilize relations, because I think everybody understands, as echoing the premier's speech, it's man-made, it's manufactured. A lot of these tensions should not exist and is harming everyone around the world. And I think there will be people who will realize that from time to time and correct it. But I think generally, we need to find coexistence in this very diverse, multicultural world. JFK once said, "Make the world safe for diversity."
How do you see businesses, particularly American businesses, and U.S.-China businesses in the environment of the China-U.S. Reality right now? What is the so-called smarter choices?
Well, first of all, American and Chinese companies share one common feature, which is they're highly competitive and they like to win. And it's that competitive nature that pushes their innovation and actually makes everybody better off, especially the consumers. It's that finding that degree of competitive collaboration where you both compete and collaborate that I think is the sweet spot and a more realistic spot. And we have many, many examples of that, especially in the renewable sector. You know, Chinese are dominating in battery making, but then they're also building factories in Germany and electric bus vehicles. China will have a huge market in that, and the Americans and Japanese are taking that technology and investing in Chinese companies back to their own markets. And that is the right kind of market-determined choices rather than man-made or forced by some other element. But I think that trust is really important as well, and we're losing a lot of trust in this environment. But again, there's a difference between the macro and the micro. For instance, in AI collaboration, the AI collaboration between China and US is far outstrips any second country pair. To a large degree. I hope that will continue, and I think there's a lot of interest in American businesses coming into China and vice versa, but can we harness that macro environment to increase the trust and say both are open for business?
Two important topics. One is the RMB internationalization vis-a-vis the reality of dollar right now, US dollar, and the other, of course, is about the debt that China is still having in about the US Treasury. So how do you see these two issues are likely to play in the nature of relationship between China and the US?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we often talk about trade integration, but we leave out the financial integration, which, as we know, sometimes is even more consequential because of the nature of the propagation of financial crises, as these financial centers are so intrinsically linked to each other. And I think that will be a new topic in the coming years, because as China becomes more financially open, many, many more countries will be exposed to Chinese shocks and Chinese, just like Chinese central banking, just like everyone is exposed to US monetary policy. I think with regard to internationalization of the RMB, of course, there's been a great effort and with great deal of success. But we have to understand that in the end, the depth, size, and liquidity of the financial system is absolutely critical. And there's really only one economy with that level of financial sophistication, and that is the United States, because a currency is not only used to invoice trade, but also to lend, to borrow, and a key currency for international banking. And so I think, the fact that many countries have been a bit hesitant to adopt, to kind of embrace the dollar because it's often used as a financial weapon, is also going to raise the status of alternatives like the RMB. But in the end, I think that it's a long march, really, towards real internationalization, because that requires the financial system to be much more advanced than what we currently have in China.
Now, you have always been trying to be a bridge between the East and West. Earlier, there might be a lot of glamours related to it, but these days, tremendous challenges related to it. How are you trying to adjust, what is going on, and trying to be able to empathetic, while at the same time do the efficient communications?
Right. I think it's really important to see the other side's perspective and appreciating, what the grievances are from one to another, and what the areas of, the blind spots might be. And that's already very challenging to identify, but people like me, but so many others that have that multicultural or bicultural background will be able to facilitate. And I think that everyone is doing their part, because everyone has benefited from being in either country. Really, we've seen enormous economic opportunities in both. So everybody's doing their job on that dimension. I think it's a matter of understanding, also the new generation and what they can do and what they can contribute, but also understanding that cultures are so different, and they would look at the same problem with a different lens and come to completely radically different conclusions, even if they might be well-intended. And so understanding the other story will help, because in any relationship, that's more likely going to lead to win-win.